Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Kirby'sCovers.com. My name's Kirby Swinburne and today we're going to go through another lesson on playing the guitar. Now what I'm going to teach you in this lesson, again, if you're already a guitar player, it won't be anything really new. This series of 4 or 5 videos is mainly for brand new people who are just learning how to play. And in the last couple of segments we talked about buying a guitar, strings on the guitar, notes on the guitar, the pick that I typically use is a hard pick for all my songs, but there are flexible picks, softer picks. You can experiment with those. This is a couple of $100 guitar. Most of these are Yamaha's APX series guitars are $300 to $500. They are built-in tuner. They're acoustic electric. You can plug them in back here. I've never had mine plugged in anywhere. I don't have an amp, but you can use them on stage. Plugged in. And we looked at some chords in the last little bit, major chords mostly. We talked about some rhythm that you can use in groups of 3, chord changes, doing bass runs between the chords, playing bass notes when you're doing your rhythm, mainly in the country genre, but it applies to folk and it applies to other genres as well. And in this section, I just want to talk about flats and sharps, minor chords, a little bit about augmented and diminished chords. I'm not a theory guy, so if you've got questions about theory, I'm not the guy, right? I don't read music. I never took a lesson. Don't know anything about theory. Don't know any scales. Never learned a scale. So nothing against that. I just didn't. It just never crossed my path to do that. So I just learned from playing by ear. And so let's look at these groups of 3s that we were talking about in the previous segments. But before we do that, I want to because I want to talk about the minor chords. Mainly in these groups of 3, the rhythm stays the same, right? These bass notes that we talked about, they still apply to the minors as well. Like if I'm playing an A minor, my bass note's still going to be an E note, right? Same as if I was playing the A with the major. It's the same bass note. So if you've been looking at my previous lessons, all this is going to be the same. Just the fact that we're playing a minor chord doesn't really change anything in that regard. But before we get into that, let me show you a little something that I learned many years ago in terms of playing flats and sharps. Now, a flat note is a little bit lower than the actual note you're trying to get to. So, for example, the G note right here, the flat note on that would be here. It's not quite a G. It's not an F, right? And it's not a G. It's in between. So they call it a flat. If you're looking at it from this angle, it's a G flat note. But if you're looking at it from the F position, it's an F sharp. It's above F, right? It's higher. So depending on your reference, what you'll call these chords. Let me show you what I mean. The E chord's typically played with these 3 fingers: your G string, your D string, your A string, right? Root note at the top is your E. But I could take that chord and I could play with the last 3 fingers by doing this, right? Now, that kind of sets me up nicely to play my F chord. If I was to play this F, I would just slide this up a fret, play these 2 bottom strings, and play this F note up here with my thumb, or I can bar this with this whole index finger, trying to get this top note and these 2 bottom strings to ring, like that. Okay, this is one of the harder chords to play when you're learning, because you go through the alphabet A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then there's no H. It doesn't go any further than G. That's 7 major chords, right? So if we were to play the E chord here, and if I go to the F chord, all I've done is I've slid up a fret, right? I just moved this to there, and I planted these 2 fingers on the board. And now from here, I can go all the way up this fretboard, and I can hit all the majors. I can hit all the flats and all the sharps that I need for most songs that I'm ever going to use, right? So there's my E, there's my F. Now if I go to this position here, like we just talked about, this is an F sharp or a G flat, depending on which way you're looking at it. If I go to the G chord here, you see my A chord is up here, the major, the next with the dot here on the board. So between G and A, I've got a fret right here, right? Nothing's changing. My fingers aren't moving off in different positions. I'm just sliding it up, right? So G. So my next position up would be a G sharp or an A flat, depending on my frame of reference. Right? Then I get up to the A chord, right? Same thing, A sharp or B. A B is the next right? There's my B, which is, I could be a B flat. And these are typically referenced with, for example, like the G chord, the G sharp would be a G with a pound symbol or the hashtag. And if you wanted to call it an A flat, it would be the letter A, capital letter A with a small b. That indicates on a piece of sheet music that this is a flat, right? And you can go all the way up the board here, right? Call it whatever you want. When you hit the majors, you'll have to call it a major, but when you get in between them, you can call it a flat or a sharp, and you'll see that written two different ways on most chord sheets, right? And all the way up to this, up to the C sharp or A or D flat to a D, right? And then all the way up to the double dots, which is your E, which is back to the beginning here. Okay? You could do the same thing with minors. You could take this E chord and you could lift this finger off the board. And you got an E minor, right? If I go to the F chord, I could lift this finger off the board and cover the bottom three with this index, and now I've got an F minor. And what do you think this is called here? This is in the G position, right? That's G major, that's G minor. So same thing. I'm just replacing the bottom three and lifting that finger off the board. So same thing here. I've got a G flat minor or an F sharp minor. Same thing here. I've got a G sharp minor or an A flat minor. Okay? A minor, same as that A minor there. So all the way up the board, whether you're playing a flat or a sharp or a minor, with bottom three, 2 and 1 on the top, you can pretty quickly find what you're looking for. All right, and that's done by playing the last three fingers on the E chord down here. You don't have to, of course. You can just quickly move, but you know, it's just a little something that I learned many years ago. Just slog your way up the board without changing anything on here, and by just doing that, you get the minors all the way up. Typically, the minors are played down here. Like if you're playing an A minor, a B minor, you can take this A minor, for example, do the same thing, play it with the last three fingers, and then as you slide up, play this B note. You're going to play a bar here now because you need this bottom string and you need the B note. So you get A minor, B minor, C minor, D minor. D minor sometimes is, or many times is played this way, right? So it's the same chord, right? Play it up here. So take your pick, right? But typically the minors are down here. So you have E minor, F minor, G minor, right? A minor, B minor, C minor, D minor, E minor again, back to the F. And so you can play these minors all down in this part of the board here. Okay, take that A minor and you can do the same thing, slide it up and play whatever variation of a D minor or C minor or whatever you need. Okay, so that covers that. So the flats and sharps, all done with this kind of a technique. Minors, same thing. If you play the bottom, you know, the B, the G, and the D string, and then play this bottom string. Now, if you were just going to do this with 4 strings on the bottom, you could, but you most times want this bass note in here, or a root note in here, right? So you know where you are. This is of course a D flat, right, or C sharp minor. So there would be a D flat minor or a C sharp minor, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about augmented chords for a second and diminished chords. Now I don't typically. I can say this pretty much. I've never really memorized any of these augmented and diminished chords. The majors and the minors for sure, and the flats and sharps, I'd memorize those, and the sevenths. Let's talk about sevenths for a second, then I'll talk about the augmented. The seventh chords is the same thing when you're talking with these groups, the 3 that we looked at in the last segment, with A, D, and E. You'll typically have 2 major, you'll have 2 7th chords in there, and these are like leaning chords, I call them. They're leaning into another chord. So my A chord, you just play with this open right here. Open G string would give you an A7, or you can play it this way. But you can hear there's a change coming, right? It's getting ready to go somewhere, and that's typically down to the D. And then on the E chord, when you're playing this group of 3, E, A, and or I should say A, D, and E, as we talked about in that grouping of 3, you'll have another 7th leaning back to the A in this case. So that's played with the B string, the E7. Right, you can hear it. You can hear that seventh that says I'm getting ready to move. So I'm leaning into another chord. So those groupings of three, you typically have an A7 and an E7 in that group. In the C, F, and the G chord sequence, typically you'll have the C, the seventh, C7 was played there with that G string right here, or D string I should say. No, G. Yeah, it's a G string. Down to the F, back to the G, and then you'll have the bottom string here on this seventh chord on the G7 leaning into the C. So again, you'll hear this getting ready to go somewhere. Now, I'm not going to go to a D here because, as I said, with these groups of three, they kind of work together in country, for example. Right? If you're starting a song in C, you'll typically have an F and a G in there. So seventh, C7 there, F back to the G, G7 back to the C. If I'm playing in D, I have a D, G, and an A, so my D chord, and then my leaning D7 is leaning me into a G, right? You'll typically hear this. That's played with the B string there, the G, and the bottom string there. Kind of reverse your fingers there. Again, I wouldn't play a G7 here because that would lean me into a C, and C is not part of this group, right? The G, maybe back to the D, back to the A, A7, leaning me into a D, leaning me into a G, right? So these two seventh chords will be part of that group, the D7 and the A7. E, you have an E7 right here with the B string, back to the A, back to the E, up to a B7 typically, right? You could play a B, right? But B7 is common in country when you're playing a song that starts in E. And you'll typically hear a leaning chord, a leaning seventh chord. That's usually the E7 to the A, or the B7 leaning back to the E. And the G chord, the last group of three, which is G, C, and D, same thing. You have a leaning seventh chord into a C, and then you'll have a D chord and a D7 leaning back to the G. That's typically what you'll hear. Right, very common in country and folk, and probably some classic rock as well. All right, so those are the sevenths, and we talked about the flats and sharps and the minors. So the minor makes a big difference because it opens up a whole new range of songs. For example, when you're playing your typical G, C, and D, you throw an E minor in there, and you're kind of back in the 50s, right, with the old doo-wop stuff. So having these minors in your back pocket, it opens up a whole new range of chords. Same within the C. If you're playing a C, F, and a G, typically you'll have an A minor, right, to the F, to the G. So just that one extra chord will open up a lot more songs for you. So it's good to know these minor chords. The augmented and diminished chords, I never actually learned those when I was learning guitar, and I still to this day have never really learned the actual names. When I'm listening to a song and I hear one of these chords, and you'll hear them. Now, major sevenths are a little different. Major sevenths are kind of like more common. Like you'll hear that C major 7 and F major. You'll hear they kind of stand out, right? A major, you'll hear that. Right? A lot of songs, same D major 7, you'll hear that. Those ones, I've memorized a little bit, but the augments and the diminished chords, I've never really gotten around to memorizing those too much, because right, you hear those kind of, or and the reason is because when you go into software and you look up these chords, you'll often get 5 or 6 different names for the same chord. So which is it? I mean, if I'm playing a major chord, there's one name for a G chord, and it's called a G chord. But if you play an augmented or a diminished chord and you go into software and say, what's that chord? It'll give you 3 or 4 or 5 different names. So which one is it? I don't know. Because of the theory of the chord, which I don't know, but just because of the notes that make up that chord, it could be called 3 or 4 different, 5 different chords. So I use a site called chordbook.com, C-H-O-R-D, chordbook, B-O-O-K, one word. And in there, you can drag these little dots. I got a little tray of dots, and you can drag them onto each string, onto the fretboard, and then hit the word strum, and it'll play the chord. And then you can play your guitar along with it, make sure you're playing the right chord. You can turn off strings by clicking the little X, so it doesn't play the string. So like, you don't want that E note ringing there, so you can turn that off by clicking the end of the board on the software, and it'll turn it off. And it will give you all the different names of these various augmented, diminished chord shapes. I may have it on my sheet. I try to explain them in the lesson when I'm encountering one of these, because they're not common, right? They're not as common as a major, minor, or 7th chord, and they're not really as common as, a major 7th chord that we just looked at a couple there. Typically, they're in these Vegas kind of songs, the D. Martin songs, or love songs. Sometimes you'll hear them in love songs, certain love songs, or you'll hear them in big band kind of songs, right? And so, unless you're playing, or jazz, or like a lot of jazz songs will have that kind of stuff, that structure in it, but I don't play a lot of jazz, so that sort of thing, I don't encounter them all the time when I'm learning a song. Somebody has a request. It's, one chance in 50 that there's an augmented or a diminished chord in there, and I just never ever bothered learning them. But the chordbook.com will help you find the right chord shape, and then you can play it on your guitar, hit the strum, and away you go. And there's other features in there that I don't use that are, advanced. So if you're a music guitar player, it's a good site to go to and just poke around and learn some chords. It's a great resource, and I use it. It helped me build my chord sheets. All right, so I think that's all I need to talk about. We talked about flats and sharps, we talked about minors, we talked about 7ths, and it opens up, like the 7th chords are not that important. You can leave them out, and a lot of times I'll put a 7th chord in even though it's not in the original recording, because it's a leaning into a change kind of a chord. That's how I look at 7ths. But minor chords will certainly expand your horizon, and any augmented, diminished chords, they're usually, not very frequent, but you'll encounter them from time to time. And the same with the major 7th kind of chords. You'll hear them. They're very, very soft, very kind of romantic sounding, right? I don't use them, a lot of them. I mean, you'll hear like a G major 7 or an F major 7, C major 7. They stand out, right? You can hear them. D major 7, A major 7. But they're not common as a minor chord, for example, in a lot of songs. All right, so that's all I got for this lesson. Hopefully that was helpful to you. As I said, all the strumming patterns that we learned, the root notes and bass notes and all the changes between, most of that stuff stays the same. Sometimes, instead of doing a 4-2 open, you'll maybe do a, right, you might do a 3-2 open instead of a 4-2 open. You may encounter that, but as far as the playing, root, down, up, bass, up, down, up. I'm still playing the same as I would play on a major chord. That doesn't change. The bass run might change a bit, but playing the bass normally won't change when you're playing in minor chords. All right, so in the next segment, probably the last segment, we'll look at, excuse me, a little dry. I'm in a new hotel room for a couple of weeks. The other place that we were in wasn't very recording friendly. I'm hoping to get more songs done for the site for the next couple of weeks that we're here in this place. But the next lesson that I'll do is probably a little bit of picking, and we'll talk about how I take songs apart and kind of my thought process on it. We'll violate any copyright issues with certain songs. I won't mention any songs, but I'll give you an idea of kind of what my process is of going through it. And hopefully that will wrap it up, and anybody learning to play the guitar will have a little grasp on some of the basics, and hopefully it'll take you wherever you want to go playing music. Guitar is a great instrument to learn, and I have just scratched the surface. There's a lot of great things you can do with finger picking and different styles of music and stuff that is way above me. But I try to cover a lot of different song variations in my site, as you know, if you've been following me for a few years. We got a lot of different varieties of stuff there, and by playing those songs, you get all these patterns. They just come into your head after a while. You don't even think about it. Just, oh yeah, I hear that. I know how to duplicate it. Give me the guitar, and you'll be off to the races. All right, that's it, folks. We'll see you in the next lesson.